UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, do you ever run out of steam? Start something really enthusiastically and then just get fed up, wearied, jaded. What's the point? Maybe it gets so bad that you just can't cope anymore and you despair and anxiety lays you low, panic sets in. What's going on when something you used to love becomes the dread of your life? When something you revelled in is a burden that's too great to bear? When something that brought out your best now makes you want to run away and hide? We hear the phrase burnout quite a lot, and there's a lot of advice around on how to avoid it. But what is burnout? Where does it come from? How does it work? What contributes to it? And when we burn out, can we be reignited and maintain a healthy life? Joining me today to explore this and how we can even get burnout from church is Jo Johnson, Consultant Neuropsychologist. And I know, Jo, that it's not a medical diagnosis. I'll be honest with you, when I hear the phrase burnout, I think of jet engines and fuel or electrical circuits rather than anything else. But what does that phrase mean to you as a health professional?
I think a lot of people hear burnout and they think it is a medical diagnosis, but I think a lot of people would describe it as a physical or emotional exhaustion, perhaps, that is secondary to work-related stress. I don't think it's often as clear as that. Often we're burned out on life, perhaps, rather than just work, and it might feel like work is the trigger set of circumstances. There's also an interesting new term that's called rust out that's being bandied around a lot at the moment. And I understand that rust out means that you're actually being underutilized.
Right.
So for me, perhaps both of these things are about when I become mismatched to my context. And for me, that might be work specifically, it might be work and life, or it might even be how much I'm doing at church. So I'm just feeling exhausted and discouraged. And that can be, as you described earlier, on a spectrum from just a bit fed up to suicidal.
So it's interesting that, though, the emphasis seems to be on almost the physicality of our experience rather than our mental health. I think a lot of people would assume that burnout, that feeling of being fed up, that feeling of being, feeling jaded and world weary, that's a mental health issue rather than a physical health issue.
I think it's a real combination, and us humans, us flawed humans, we're the whole package, aren't we? And I think we're all different. And for some of us, our emotional problems will show in our bodies more than in our minds. I think mind, body is so interconnected, it's hard to pull those things apart. And I think as part of burnout, we would suggest that there are symptoms in every area. So there will be cognitive symptoms, troubles concentrating, remembering, even paying attention. There will be physical symptoms, which can be milder things like fatigue, or right up to high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes. There's emotional symptoms, tearfulness, irritability, and then there's symptoms that show in our behavior. So perhaps people that burst out in anger, or maybe your thing is going to bed too much and withdrawing. So I would suggest that it's an end point that probably shows in all areas of life.
And I suppose in some ways using the phrase, I'm just burnt out, or I'm experiencing burnout, it acts as a coverall that gives us permission to examine what is actually going on, because that is an important part of this, isn't it? We need to acknowledge that this is a real thing, not just something that's amorphous around me.
No, it is absolutely a real thing. I think it's complicated. I think it's mediated by work-related factors, but most of all, at some level there's me in it. So we're all people with our own histories, and with everything that's happened to us, we have lenses through which we see the world. And so perhaps if a lot of difficult stuff has happened to me in my life, I might have lenses like I'm not respected, or people don't like me, or I must not let people down. So sometimes some of those factors are really important in burnout and can mediate why some people are more vulnerable than others. And we see that, don't we? Like the same job can be done by two people, and one might thrive and one might burn out or rust out even.
And there is a part of this that kind of ties in and I suppose challenges our sense of personal identity, isn't there? That the experience of burnout, the experience, I suppose, and I don't know if the two are related, the sort of midlife crisis idea, where we get to the point where we start to look at ourselves, we go, who am I? You know, am I even a real person? What am I about? How can I identify myself? Those sorts of emotions can be very powerful in creating a lot of confusion for people about how to recover from this place.
I think that's so true. And I think identity and work are so enmeshed, kind of muddled together. God created work for a purpose, didn't he? It's pre-fall work. So it's a good thing. You know, it gives us meaning and purpose. It allows us to express creativity. It gives us social support, all sorts of things. So it's really integral, I think, to how we feel about ourselves. And which is why it's so hard hitting often when things go wrong at work. And sometimes that's to do with what's going wrong at work. So you might be working in a really toxic environment. I don't really like that word, but it kind of makes sense to lots of people. But, you know, you might be in an environment where you're being bullied consistently, or you're being put under so much pressure that is untenable for human existence. So that's really tough, and you probably just need to get out. Or it might just be that things are happening in your personal life, or as you've aged, some of those lenses are becoming more difficult. But absolutely, I think we change, and sometimes people wake up and think, you know, I'm nearly 50 or whatever midlife is these days, and actually I'm stuck in this rut. I didn't even want to come into this business in the first place. You know, often I think people are in a context that maybe they felt pressured by their parents or friends, or it seemed like right at the time, and it's become untenable for them.
But is it getting worse? Because it does sometimes feel as though, I mean, I don't know if we're just talking about it more or if people are struggling with these sorts of emotions more, but it does feel as though the incidence of people talking about, burnout, people talking about midlife crisis, people talking about not being able to cope, breaking down, it does seem to be more current in contemporary society than it did sort of 3-4 decades ago. Is that your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a recent survey done by Monster said that 70% of people doing home working, I think that's a big factor that's happened since COVID, are burnt out. So I think that's one factor. I think that technology is another massive factor for people. And I also think that our secular worldview currently, it's almost like unless you set yourself to not burn out on purpose, I think you will burn out. It's almost like the way work is now designed, the way our culture is now working, it's impossible for a human being not to burn out. So I think you have to not burn out on purpose and start to think about these things. I might even compare it, which sounds a bit bizarre, but, you know, we used to talk to our young people, didn't we, about maintaining a level of holy sexuality as teenagers. And I think that was about, you know, what our culture says is any kind of sexual immorality is fine. And actually, if you don't set out consciously to be different, to be set apart, and to set your world and your behavior and your environment accordingly, you will end up falling into the world's ways of living as a sexual being. And I think it's the same for burnout. I think it's almost like if we don't start talking to young people about, if you don't set your working life intentionally, you will burn out. You will fall into the world's patterns of overworking, not taking rest, not having any boundaries around your technology, and breaking.
So what is it about the modern age, or perhaps even the societal mindset of the modern age, that is pushing us towards burnout? I mean, is it just the sort of work ethic we have, or is it the expectations that we have in life?
I think it's loads of things. And I think identity is really key, as you mentioned earlier. I think we've gone from a place where our identity used to be given to us, either by God or by the roles we had in families or by passed down work. More people worked within family communities. And what has happened now is the current view of identity is we get it from within ourselves, or we get it from what we have or what we do. So I think there's a lot of pressure from within about that. But I also think since COVID, there's so much home working. I think that's a really massive factor. A friend of mine the other day was saying that she's been working from home. They lost their offices in COVID. And not only do people have home working in all their meetings, but they have their cameras off. And I'd never really thought about that as another factor of we're not connecting as human beings. And what we know and what God has designed us for is to connect as human beings. You know, there's so much research and neurology and everything that supports connection is such a preventer for any element of mental ill health and even dementia. So actually, we're working from home. When I first came into practice as a psychologist, I had a desktop, don't you know? And actually, it stayed on my desk. How unique is that? So when I signed off, I worked 3 or 4 days a week. And on a Thursday, I switched off my computer at 5 o'clock. And no one expected to see or hear an email from me until Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Yeah. And so Friday, Saturday, Sunday were mine to take rest, to parent, to do all of that. And now that's not possible. And, you know, my son has recently been working in the NHS, and he was getting emails from his superiors at 2 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, this is the context that we're setting. This is what the world is running on. It's 24/7. And, you know, the expectation around email is that if I email you today, then I will get an email response by today. And often, you know, people will email me, and then within 3 hours, they'll email me again to say, did you get my email? So there's this expectation of instant response 24/7. And every time an email, you know, does that ping, or a text does that ping, that does something to my neurology, which says, wake up, feel stressed, feel anxious, feel restless, because something's about to happen that you need to deal with. So what we're ending up with is human beings who are not designed to be alert all the time. We're creating a state where people are constantly hypervigilant, and how that feels in the body is in anxiety and restlessness and stress. You can't turn it off.
And it is almost like an addiction, isn't it? The way that we
100%.
Respond to these stimuli.
Yeah, it's a real addiction. It's a real habit. And I mean, you just have to sit in a cafe, don't you? And if one of the people goes to the toilet, if there's just a pair, then, you know, I find it quite a fun game to watch how long that other person can just sit and stare into space. You know, they'll get their phone up, they'll start scrolling through their emails. It's almost like we've lost the ability to just be still.
So how much of our response to that, because I take your point that we almost need to be intentional and say we will not let that mindset impinge on us. But in order to do that, there is almost a sense that we need to do that in order to do that, because reflective practice, taking time to actually stop and consider, how am I being stimulated by the ping of the email? How am I being drawn into this hypervigilant state? How am I continually allowing pressure to build on my shoulders rather than having clear boundaries that I set and that I stick to? It's so easy to let those things erode if we are not being reflective about it. So is that an important part of dealing with this?
I think it's a really important part. And as I said, I think, proactiveness is always better. And I actually think we should start by talking to our young people about this stuff. But I think also we need to be role modeling it, to everybody, and talking about that, and actually, suggesting to people that it's not going well. I think otherwise it is an inevitability. And often burnout is that place where people have just gone too far and they are slaves to autopilot. They're not living on purpose at all. They're not awake and aware. They're just reacting rather than reflecting at all.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. This week we are considering with Jo Johnson, Consultant Neuropsychologist, we are considering the idea, the concept of burnout. And you made the point of the level to which it can impact us and the level to which it can undermine our lives, I suppose, in many ways, and create places of stress and tension and insecurity and loss of identity, all of those things. When we get to that point, what can we do about it? How do we come back from it? And perhaps particularly, because one of the things we haven't mentioned yet is that the fact that this can apply within the context of church as well as within the context of work. So when we lose that passion, we lose that fervor, we get wearied, we feel undermined, we feel stressed, we lose that sense of who we are in the role and the reality of our living. How do we get it back?
I think the first thing is to notice it, and if you can, to be noticing it before you're on the floor, because some of the things we've talked about, other people can see us doing. So I think it's about being accountable to each other and having courageous conversations. It would be much better to say to somebody, it really looks like you're going down a path of overworking and distraction by your work, and I wonder whether you want to have a chat about that. But if you don't wake up until the end point, then it's reaching out, it's asking for help. You can go to your GP, you can go to your pastor. A lot of organizations have employee programs, occupational health, that sort of thing, I guess. So they're kind of easy answers.
But it's not something that is an easy solution, is it? I mean, I think you talked about those lenses that we all see our lives through. I mean, I existed with my lenses for probably the best part of 55, 56 years. And then through CBT, had the opportunity to discover them. And I thought, why did nobody tell me this when I was in my 20s? I don't know that I would actually have listened when I was in my 20s. But there is that. It isn't a straightforward process to identify. It isn't a straightforward process to respond to. And there is a degree of expertise required in actually addressing these things, isn't there?
I think once you get to the real proper burnt out stage where you really do feel hopeless and helpless and even suicidal, and you're not sleeping, and you're most likely to be either clinically anxious or depressed, then I think you do need probably some professional help. And I would always encourage people to seek clinical psychology help, but I'm aware that there's a problem with that in that it's becoming increasingly hard to get a clinical psychologist on the NHS. But often clinical psychologists don't see people for so long as counsellors. So often I would say, that's a good point to start if you can access clinical psychology help. I'm, as you know, I think the reason I was invited on this podcast is I do a lot of workplace training with people to try and prevent burnout using what's a therapy called ACT, which is the most recent form of CBT. Its full name is Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, but anyone that is actually well enough qualified in it will call it ACT. So that's often a rookie tell. If someone calls it ACT, they're probably not expert enough to see you.
And that is, I mean, although we're smiling about it, that is at the same time a valid point, because you do have to be careful who you go to see, because just because somebody has, I don't know, counsellor or psychotherapist or whatever on their door, not necessarily as qualified as some people might assume. Yes?
Absolutely. So clinical psychology is what we call a protected title. So you cannot use it unless you are a fully qualified clinical psychologist, in the same way that you couldn't call yourself a medical doctor unless you're not. But it often surprises people to know that counsellor, psychologist, psychotherapist are not protected titles. So you could walk out of your radio station today, if you so desired, and you could find an office and you could put a notice on the outside that said psychotherapist or psychologist, and no one could take you, do anything about that.
Really?
So
staggering.
That's an anxiety, really. And sometimes I see people who've been in therapy for 5 or 6 years. That is unnecessary for the most complex of situations. So a clinical psychologist will mostly work with someone for 6 to 10 sessions. That is most often enough. So I think that's worth bearing in mind if you're seeking private help and you're thinking about cost. So that's why I say that. It's not just because I'm a clinical psychologist. That the person you're getting is qualified. And if you go and see a clinical psychologist and they think, actually, my skills are too, you don't actually need to be seeing me. You could actually see a counsellor or somebody else I'll recommend, then they will do that, because it's part of our professional integrity to point someone in the right direction. So even if you just go for an initial assessment with a clinical psychologist, that's often worth doing.
That's a good point and well worth noting. So can we just sort of circle back then to ACT, he says, remembering not to call it ACT. So when you say that it's like perhaps the most current or a recent development from CBT, what does ACT do? How does it work? What's the goal that it's drawing out of me if I go through the process?
Okay, well, probably we should start by defining what CBT is, because a lot of people won't know maybe. So CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. So that's been around for quite some years. And what it means is something very simple. Cognitive refers to your thinking processes. So what goes in your mind in the form of words or images is your cognitive ability. Behavior is more transparent. That means what you do, your behavior. So what it's saying is there's an intimate relationship, a connected relationship between what goes on in your mind and what you end up feeling and doing. So a really simple example is, maybe I'll look at you right now and I think, oh, Paul's giving me a funny look. That must be because he really hates me and he thinks that I'm the worst guest he's had on for really some time. So that's going to make me feel really anxious, really insecure, and it'll probably make me sort of speak really fast, not be very present, really want to get this over with. And then afterwards, it might make me feel feelings of shame or self-loathing. And then the next person that asks me to do a podcast or something, I'll say no. So something as simple as that, the thought, Paul is looking at me in a strange way. So another person might think, oh, Paul's concentrating really hard on what he's doing. And so as a result, they'll feel completely fine about chatting to you. So that's what we're doing all the time. That's what we mean by our lenses that we are looking at the world with all the time. My mind is making interpretations that are mostly unconscious. And most people, as you say, can easily get to even death, let alone their fifth decade, without having any conscious awareness of what's going on for them. And they're being triggered all over the place by different people and hemorrhaging behaviors that everybody else puzzles over, but they don't really understand that. So that's CBT. So ACT is indeed one of the more recent versions of CBT. So its premise is still the same, that what goes on in our mind is really influential for our emotional states and our behavioral states. And the Bible said that, didn't it? The Bible says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It says, take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. It says, think on things that are honest and just and of good report. Get rid of rage and malice. It's a thought that starts everything. It says in James, you have the thought, then before you know it, you're into the temptation and then into the behavior. So, it wasn't really Aaron Beck who came up with CBT. It was God.
Yes.
Who is, he's the psychologist because he created us as mind, body, human beings, and he breathed life inside of us, didn't he? And made us in his image. So, but we're fallen. So these lenses have come, and whether you want to think of that as, voices from Satan, I know some people like to see all of those difficult thoughts as accusations and lies from Satan, or whether you want to just see it as faulty equipment from our fallen state. I don't think you have to be a Christian to know that most of our mind content is negative and often difficult. And the mind's job is to keep us safe and keep us connected. And so it's often doing a lot of, be careful, people don't like you, watch what you say, didn't you make a fool of yourself on that podcast? Those kind of voices are common to us all as flawed humans.
And the thing is, as you say that, length and breadth of the nation, we're all sitting around going, hey, she's not wrong. That's exactly how I feel. Because it is a human instinct. It is part of how we function to be continually assessing those things, as you said earlier. So how does acceptance and commitment therapy, I suspect I know what acceptance and commitment mean. I suspect it's to recognize that reality and accept that is going on in me, but then commit to how I respond to that. Am I thumbnailing that correctly?
Yeah, you're on exactly the right track. I mean, I'm not really a fan of the word acceptance because it makes it sound like, I'm having all these painful thoughts and feelings and I just have to get on with it.
Yeah, there's nothing I can do.
So I think often ACT practitioners will talk about a willingness to have those difficult thoughts and feelings and to become conscious of them rather than being jerked about by them in a kind of puppeted zombie-like state. And I think sometimes from a biblical point of view, maybe you could talk about when you're on autopilot, when you're not noticing those voices, your flesh is ruling. So, I don't notice the thought that says everyone hates me, and then I withdraw and don't do anything. So that really impacts my behavior. And then that really reinforces the fact that no one likes me because I'm at home by myself. And there's no opportunity to have that challenge. So acceptance and commitment therapy is around noticing our inside difficult thoughts and feelings, recognizing we have them, that's part of being human, but really becoming increasingly aware of those thoughts and feelings so that they don't sabotage us into behaviors that take us away from our values. So the starting point of ACT is values rather than goals. That's one of the things I prefer over CBT. So you start by asking people, what are your values? What personal qualities do you want to bring to the table in any given context? So in a family situation, that might be qualities like kindness, patience. In this context, it might be authenticity, courage. I guess the interesting thing about values for us as Christians is the most popular values that people tell me map almost identically onto the fruits of the Spirit.
Yeah.
So love, joy, peace, self-control, kindness, gentleness. I've got stuck, Paul. You know the list. I'm sure most people out there do. So, it starts with values, and actually, if you want to see that from a Christian perspective, you can start with the fruits of the Spirit, and you can start to think about, if that's what I want to bring to the table, when I have a thought that says, that person was really rude to me, or everyone rejects me, or I can't trust people, or I'm always left out. If I really buy into that thought as the truth, that's a very ACT question. If I buy into that thought as the truth, everyone hates me, where is that going to take me in terms of how I treat myself and others? So if I buy into that thought, everyone hates me, then I'm not going to go to church. I'm not going to be honest with you. And I am going to treat myself with a lot of self-loathing, which will probably make me eat a lot of junk food. It will make me isolate myself, or it might make me punish you for hating me before you even have. So I might see the frown on your face and think, see, he hates me. And I will go away saying, I met with that person for coffee and they were really sullen, and that's because no one likes me. So we can begin to see how these things impact us. And the difference with CBT is you were probably taught to challenge that. So how likely is it? How reasonable is it? How close to the truth is it that everybody hates me? So, oh, look, my husband doesn't hate me most of the time. My next door neighbor quite likes me. So that's not true, is it? So I don't believe that anymore. But actually what we know now is that challenging isn't especially helpful. It doesn't change the thought, and it doesn't change the behavior as much as we once thought. So what we've realized with ACT is actually it's a noticing of the thought that is important. So what we would do in ACT is I would say, I am noticing that I'm having the thought that Paul hates me. And I wouldn't challenge that. So I just notice it and name it. Or it's the everybody hates me thought. I would just leave it like that. And over time, what we see is that often that thought will diminish, but it certainly has less impact on my behavior the more we call those thoughts out. And I think a lot of the Christian sort of CBT type programs like Freedom in Christ, some people would have heard of that, they would take that an extra step further. So they would name the thought, here's me having the thought, everyone hates me. And then they would say, like, take that captive to the obedience of Christ. So, my identity in Christ is safe and sound, and actually I am loved, and it doesn't even matter if you hate me or not. So they would do that extra bit. So ACT fits quite nicely in a secular practice or with Christian programs as well.
Because it creates that environment where we can recognize the reality of our temptation, predisposition, our inclination to think in a particular inaccurate way, and it gives us the opportunity to then bring the balance and the understanding, not of having to analyze every detail, which often makes us feel worse, but actually accepting that reality, seeing that thought is there, accepting its presence, but then turning our attention, if you like the Psalms, lifting our eyes to the hills. Where does our help come from? Not there. It comes from the Lord. Lift our eyes higher. It is that sort of concept, that sort of idea, to refocus where we're going. So how does that help us to deal with the pattern of life that leads us to burnout?
So I think it's about noticing and naming that thought and then taking action in a more helpful direction. So, it's noticing what that thought is likely to drive me to, and instead doing what's helpful. So creating towards action. So I suppose when you're in the state of burnout, it's beginning to understand what's led to that for you. What are the mediating factors? And that will be hugely different for different people. So some people will have overworked because they are running away from feelings of anxiety and a thirst, running towards a thirst for affirmation. So if I'm not successful at work, I'm not good enough, or I won't be revered enough amongst my gender peers or whatever. For other people, it will be about letting people down. I have to work this hard or I'll let people down. In a church context, it may be not fully understanding my identity in Christ or grace. So it might be like, actually, I'm working really hard at work, and then I'm going to every church meeting, and I'm leading every group, and I'm running a house group in order to do good works, because I think God will be impressed with that, or other Christians will be impressed with that, and that will somehow get me a pass to heaven or a greater spiritual status, I guess. So I think it's a hard one to say, and the overarching thing that we all have is we all have control over our arms and legs and mouth and nothing else. That's such bad news, and I say that so many times a day, because so much of our frustration comes from trying to control other people. So I can't control my prime minister. I can't control other Christians. I can't control my colleagues, my family. And so that's the first thing. I can only control my arms and legs and mouth. So a lot of ACT work is like, what do you want to do with your arms and legs and mouth that will take you towards the antidote to burnout, which is actually re-engaging with all of the things that God designed you to be and to thrive at. So, re-engaging with rest, re-engaging with a balanced diet, re-engaging with sleep, friendship, prayer, whatever you've dropped out, because you don't get to burnout by doing all of those things. You get to burnout by overworking mostly, or overcommitting to a task-based life and being on your phone too much and not sleeping and all of those things. So we would work out, what is it that you need to do to get back some balance, because you've become unbalanced in your life. You've overcommitted to work, and for different people that will be different things. So some people will be starving themselves and under eating. Some people will be hugely overweight because of the path they've taken. Some people will be sleeping too much. Some people will be sleeping too little. So we'll start to look at what I might call, or ACT might call, camera behaviors. What will I be seeing on a camera that is part of your burnout behaviors, and what do we need to change? And then we will work backwards to what thoughts and feelings have bullied you into going this burnout route, rather than, thriving with a balanced way of life. And for some people that will be anxiety and I can't let people down type of thoughts. And for other people it will be, I need to be the best person in my neighborhood at work. I need to earn the most money, to have the biggest house, so that I will impress my peers.
And it is a perpetual cycle that we have to continually, I suppose, examine, address, look at. So for a final thought in this, given what God has called us to, given what God has shaped us as, given what he has defined us as, and our identity in Christ, and you mentioned it before, in his grace and in his provision for us, what do I need to do day by day to create a space that protects me from excessive stress, excessive anxiety, that road to burnout, or indeed that inclination to rust out by stepping back from everything? What do I need to do on a daily basis as the first steps of creating a balanced, healthy perspective that will enable me to function, to serve, to aspire, but not to get extreme?
I think the first thing is to recognize that you will burn out unless you consciously choose not to. That is the inevitable consequence of the world we're living in. So it's very much being intentional. I think you have to have some really honest conversations with yourself and with God about, firstly, am I overworking? Is work taking up a disproportionate amount of my time in comparison to rest, family, social connection, exercise, etc.? And if the answer is yes, is it true that I don't have any choice about that? And if so, do I need to actually get out of that work environment? Is it true that actually this is about my boss's demands, or the fact that I have to work this much to pay my bills? Because I would say that that's the minority of cases where people have no choice, that they're either on the breadline and they have to work 22 hours a day to support themselves, or the demands are all coming from work. I think often, if we're honest with ourselves, there's two situations going on. We're either running away from a difficult marriage, a difficult church situation, feelings of not good enough somewhere else. Because what humans hate is not feeling good enough. We love feeling affirmed and good enough. So if the only place that you're getting that is at work, you will run towards work and avoid feeling a rubbish dad, a rubbish husband, or rubbish in church, whatever is not working for you. So are you running away from those situations? Or are you running away from the difficult thoughts and feelings that have been historical or have emerged? So feelings of fear that I won't be as rich as other people, fear that God won't provide for me tomorrow, anxiety about being judged by people at work as being lazy, or by your peers as being unsuccessful. Are you running away from feelings of emptiness and low mood? Are you running away from grief? Are you running away from thoughts like, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I need to be rich and successful to be somebody? Because often that's the issue, that you're running away from situations, or you're running away from thoughts or feelings. So a really honest look in myself and a really honest conversation with people around me. So am I working too much? And what do you think is the issue that's going on? I think that's a courageous thing to do. And I think also as older people, we need to be role modeling. There's no point as a father saying you're created in a certain kind of way and you're complete in Christ if you as a father are at work 21 hours a day and on your phone constantly on a Sunday and overweight and unhealthy, and you say to your child, you're constantly on your child's back about their education, and their homework and their career. Because you're giving really mixed messages, and we need to be talking to our teenagers and the people that are coming up below us really early on about how do you set an intentional way of living where you will glorify and honor God with your activities rather than end up burnt out and frazzled and depressed.
And therein is the answer, isn't it? How do we set an intentional pattern of living where we glorify God in our life, in our thinking, in our behaviors, in our perspectives? And we recognize the importance of doing that in so many other spheres when we start to talk about things like morality and integrity. So why do we struggle to recognize it within the context of work, within the context of rest, within the context of choosing not to burn out, intentionally planning our lives to avoid this pitfall that stretches increasingly in modern society in front of people, but as people who know the truth of God, we have the opportunity to avoid. You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. My guest today to explore this is Jo Johnson, Consultant Neuropsychologist. It has been absolutely fascinating, Jo, to talk this through with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
And thank you as well to Rachel, my producer, for this week's podcast. Why not join us next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da.